Development cannot be compromised, neither environment can be compromised in the pretext of one another. The rate of consumption should not surpass the rate of salvation. Now, this is highly important. The crop generated is also containing chemical elements, which means if you intake those food, that is also going to affect your life and health. Good morning and welcome to the third session in Chapter 1, Unit 1, second semester in B.C.A. Sustainable Development, where we're going to talk about sustainable development in economics, which is a very interesting chapter. Moving forward, the word sustainable development can be defined as an approach to the economic development of a country without compromising the quality of environment for the future generation. Now, this is the word that we need to learn for today. Now, development cannot be compromised, neither environment can be compromised in the pretext of one another. So what I'd like to point out here is that one side, when we are talking about a futuristic nation, when we are talking about becoming the superpower in the coming years, but that doesn't mean or that doesn't give you the right to destroy the environment where you are. It doesn't give you the power or permission to destroy the nature in the name of growth. So that's why in economics we say that the price of environmental damage is paid in the form of land degradation, soil erosion, air and water pollution, deforestation, etc. This damage may surprise us as the advantages of more quality output of goods that's been given in form of these services and goods altogether. But nevertheless, one should not forget this factor very clearly, that as per our economic growth, we are not supposed to destroy the environment. We are not supposed to go back and say that in order to produce more, we will create pollution. Now, that cannot be accepted at all. Now, moving forward, we have this factor of sustainable goals. What are the sustainable goals that we have in our mind? The first one, to promote the kind of development that minimizes the environmental problem. Definitely, yes, we don't want environmental problems to be coming up now and then. To meet the needs of the existing generation without compromising the quality of environment for future generations. So one side, we are going to talk about development without disturbing environment. The other side, we are also going to talk about the needs and wants of the generation without compromising the factors for the upcoming generation. Now, the other thing that we have been trying to talk about is achieving the sustainable development. How are we going to achieve this sustainable development? One side, let's understand if you're going to do this following points. By restricting human activities, technological development should be input effective and not input utilizing. Let's concentrate on that point for a minute. One side, when we go ahead and tell people that, you're going to be a part of a sustainable environment altogether, people ask you this question: how, when, and why? The reason is that one side you see the input costs are rising, and the other side you will also see that the income is coming down. When I say it's coming down, it's not sufficient enough. So what is happening now is that in order to manage the efficiency of the input cost factors altogether, what is that we have done? What is that we have decided, and how have we decided? Now, that's a very big question that comes to the mind of people. So I would always say here that technological development should be more on the input effectiveness. So when I'm going to use a raw material from the nature, from the environment, that should be an effective material, that should be cost effective, that should be realistic, and that should produce some value to me. It should not be in such a manner that this itself becomes a complaint altogether. So I don't want this factors anymore. I don't want an input that will create a pressure on the environment, that will throw an existing factor on the environment. So let's not go too much behind it, but let's try to build this environment as far as possible. followed by the rate of consumption should not surpass the rate of salvation. Now, this is highly important. Why? Because consumption should not surpass the rate of salvation, which means if you keep on consuming more and you don't leave anything behind, you're not able to leave back the salvage value of the environment, then you're not going to survive. What is very important for us here is that consumption rate has to be balanced with that of the growth rate. You cannot afford eating away the environment. You can't just take away the chunk. You can't just take away that big piece of cake and leave the table empty. You need to give back something to the environment here. So that's where I would always like to say that the rate of consumption should not surpass the rate of salvation. You can't afford doing that. The next thing is that for the renewable resources, the rate of consumption should not surpass the rate of production. Now, what happens here is that to produce a resource, it takes time. We have to keep that in our mind. Resources, natural resources, when I'm speaking about, they don't just create at the speed of light. They cannot be just reproduced at a flash. So what we need to do here is that we need to understand the rate of consumption versus the rate of production. So when you are consuming something, you also need to understand that the rate of production, getting back that resource on track, will take time. It is not going to happen overnight. So what we need to spend here at time, that we have to understand that you need to balance your consumption. You cannot just go on hiking up your production just to satisfy the demand cycle. But the other side, you also have to think that how am I going to restore the balance back in nature, balance back to the environment altogether. So that's why I would always say that the rate of production at any point of time should not surpass the rate of the renewable resources altogether. Now, all types of pollution should be minimized, and it can be achieved by the sensible use of the natural and the nature products altogether. Now, pollution is not just a local problem, it's a global problem, and thanks to the human beings' invention of more and more motor cars, bikes and automobiles that have been running through our streets and roads, which are the direct contributors of the pollution. So at some point of time, going back and thinking that should we again and again rely only on petrol diesel cars, or is it the right time for us to shift to a EV, that's electric vehicle altogether, would be right. So I would definitely like all of you to think here for a moment, how can we reduce on the pollution factor? Moving further, we're going to talk about the liberalization, globalization, privatization, and of course, we're going to talk about the sustainable development in terms of wind energy and the solar energy. Now, all of us know that the concept of this LPG that we have been talking about, liberalization, privatization, and globalization. The ideology of bringing in this concept in economics was to make the trade easier, effective, accessible and participative in nature. So that's where I would like to talk about the concept of liberalization, privatization and globalization. This was not created that we try to compete against each other, but this was created in order to cooperate with each other. At some point of time, people started understanding that this is the way to completely dominate the smaller nations in the world and take over the world under their control. Now, that is not the concept, that is not the ideology behind liberalization. What we wanted our country when we started speaking about liberalization is making things easier, making things accessible, and we wanted the Indian goods, Indian products to be made available in every corner of the world. We wanted to be a globalized nation where people understand the value of our country, where they understand the moral system, they understand the meaning in terms of our production, they add value to the goods that are being produced, and then India becomes a country which is globally identified as the developing nation, or rather the most developed nation altogether. Now, with all those things, when we talk about the word called as privatization, our aim was to give the chance for all those private companies to move forward. We didn't want to have an India which is completely blocked, which is completely saturated by the PSU sector. We wanted a system that could challenge, that could get self-motivated, that could propel the economy to the next level. So that's why I would always say that privatization was the means of giving motivation to all those entrepreneurs by which they could come forward, generate employment, make the economy more meaningful and more resourceful altogether. Now, some of the sustainable development exercise that we have been talking about is one is the wind energy, the other one is the solar energy. Now, with this, we also talk about the crop rotation, sustainable construction, efficient water fixtures, green space that is coming up, and the sustainable forestry. Now, these are all examples which I would just like to leave it here. Why? Because this is what we have been thinking for the last 15-20 years altogether. We have been more working on a concentrated manner in terms of giving the space to the people as well as for the resources, and we want something that can be retained for years to come. Now, what has happened is that with the advent of technology, probably the lifespan of products have come down so small. Now, when you look into a mobile phone, or when you look into your TV or your washing machine, fridge, or probably a music system, all of them have a very, very limited shelf life. Now, people don't want to have it for a longer time. It has become a trend, a fashion rather, that when people keep exchanging their mobiles in every 6 months, or people keep shopping for electronic gadgets every 3 months or probably within a year. Now, what happens there is that the question of recycling again comes back into the picture. You keep on throwing things into the nature, into the environment. But where is that's going to get recycled and come back to you as a balancing phenomenon altogether? So that's why what we have been trying to talk about is that whether you talk about construction, whether you talk about chemicals, or you talk about fixtures, or you talk about any kind of parks that is going to be developed, we want a sustainability. We want it to be retained for some time in the nature. So that's why we are harping upon the word sustainable development again and again. And we want this practice also to come in agriculture, the crop rotation basis. We want the system to hold it for some time and grow with it. We don't want the farmer to just, sow the seeds, reap it again, keep moving it again and again, which leads to a land degradation problem altogether. So when we talk about the crop rotation, we want to give some sustainable factor so that the soil is enriched and the farmer is able to reap his produce year by year. Followed by, what is the environmental crisis that we have been talking about? One, when we have been talking about when it fails to perform its vital function of life sustenance, that means the environment becomes suitable as soon as this happens. Now, one thing that we are talking about in the environmental factors is that at the generation of waste remains within the absorption capacity of the environment and the reasons for the environmental crisis. Environment tends to degrade because we have decided to degrade the environment. It is not that environment gets degraded by itself. We have crossed the limits of degradation. We have been just dumping the waste again and again without recycling, without bringing in a solution how to bring environment back. We have always been thinking about the factor called as production. Right from the industrial revolution today, what we have been talking about is that how to increase your exports, how to make your country more viable in terms of exports and imports. But what we have not been thinking, what we have not been able to do is that, can we just go back and think on the nature? Can we just go back and increase the forest area in India? Can we just go back and think about expansion of greenery in India? So that is where we are lacking. Why? Because the environment also has got a bandwidth. It has got a capability. It has got a limit to the extent it can take the dumping. But beyond that, the environment will definitely fail. It might feel that I am not in a position to take any more, and I start getting completely degraded. And once that degrading happens, the sustenance of life comes down. automatically human beings have got no other option and they have to just give away. Now that leads to the end of life on this great Mother Earth planet. So that's why I would like to say that the real crisis is about sustenance of life. So you need to think how to strike the balance between the nature and that of the living conditions altogether. Now, population explosion that we know about it, just look at the picture there. You're not able to find a single gap, an inch of gap. You have so much of people living in India. One side, when you call people as an asset, no doubt about it. But the other side, look at the amount of pressure, amount of thrust, amount of the factors that, things are going to be put on the environmental conditions altogether. The rate of growth of population adversely affect the environment. It increases the demand for environmental resources, but the supply is limited. The results, the overuse and misuse of the environment. So what I'm trying to see is that higher the population growth, that means the demand from the environment side is going to go up and you're going to feel that pinch. You're going to definitely get that effect saying that where is the greenery? Where is that we have been facing this dramatic climatic changes and where is the supply demand going to be met in the coming years? Followed by, now when you look at the rise in economic activity, everybody wants to become a superpower, no doubt about it. Whether you go and talk about, an islands which is located off the Pacific coast, or you want to talk like a superpower like India, which also wants to become a developing country or the most developed nation in the coming years. Everybody wants to become that superpower, and that is possible only by the production of goods and services. Now that's the base of economics, no denial about it. But then the question that comes here is that, can you grow with the environment or are you growing against the environment? Why? Because people might come back and ask you this question 110 times back to you again and again. How are you going to sustain yourself? So that's very important for all of us here to think about the economic activity. Followed by, what is environmental crisis? Again, when we are talking about the rapid industrialization, that is also becoming a very, very important factor here that we are going through because of the rising industrialization. Pollution is being caused, by which the environmental degradation is also happening. And followed by the urbanization, since too much of growth in the urban area, faster growth of slum areas are also coming up. And people do not get enough space to live in. Cities get too much crowded and clogged, so we don't have much of movable space. And this leads to the land emptying factor. The land space is occupied right, center, left, and we do not have space anymore left on this entire earth. Now, deforestation is also one thing. We have been chopping down the forest to such a great extent that probably our future generation would only have a vision or glimpse of the forest in the nature museum. We might not be probably in a position to go take them to a forest and show that this is how exactly it looks like. Followed by the increased use of pesticides and chemical fertilizers, because farmers and workers suffer from health problems by the usage of fertilizers. The crop generated is also containing chemical elements, which means if you intake those food, that is also going to affect your life and health. So another crisis that is definitely looming around us. With this, I come to the conclusion of this particular topic. I hope and believe that all the ideas that have been spoken through this particular session will be of a great help to you, both in terms of theory as well as in the practical walk of life. In the upcoming session, we are going to learn more about the environmental economics and how it is going to pave a path for the development of human beings. But until then, I want you to stay tuned, stay blessed, and stay enlightened forever. Thank you once again for joining me today on this wonderful session.